After divorce, I became homeless until a stranger asked, "Are you Michael? You just inherited 47 Tolmer." I was sitting on a cold park bench trying to make a thin jacket feel like a real coat. The words didn't make sense. It felt like a cruel joke, the kind life had been telling me for the past year. The man who spoke was named Peter. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my old car. I looked down at my dirty clothes and worn-out shoes. I hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days. The divorce from my ex-wife, Lisa, had wiped me out completely. She took the house, the savings, and my dignity. I was homeless. Then a stranger offered me $47 million, but this fortune came with a catch. Subscribe and like to see where my uncle's revenge diary led me. My own family had turned their backs on me. My brother Frank and his wife Diane had always looked down on me. When the divorce happened, they sided with Lisa. "You never were good enough for her, Michael," Frank had said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You're a failure." They were the ones who told our parents I was unstable, making sure every door was closed to me. So when Peter repeated the amount, $47 million, I just stared at him. It was a number so big it had no meaning. He explained it was from my Uncle Arnold, a man I hadn't seen in 20 years. He was the black sheep of the family, the one nobody ever talked about. A few days later, sitting in a fancy law office, it all became real. Peter showed me the documents. Uncle Arnold had built a huge business and had no children. He left everything to me. There was a letter. It was short. "Michael," it said, "I know what it's like to be cast out by your own blood. They called me a failure too. Don't let them win. Use this to build a life they can only dream of." Reading those words, something inside me shifted. The fog of despair began to clear, replaced by a cold, hard anger. This wasn't just money. It was power. It was a weapon, and I knew exactly who I was going to aim it at. For the next few months, I disappeared. I got a small, clean apartment and new clothes, but I didn't buy a fancy car or a big house. I spent my days in libraries and on the internet learning about investments and companies. I hired a private investigator, a young man named Scott, to look into Frank and Diane's lives. His report was exactly what I had hoped for. They were drowning in debt. They had a huge house in a rich neighborhood and were struggling to pay for it. They put on a big show for their friends, pretending to be successful, but it was all a house of cards. The report said they were desperately trying to sell their house to avoid bankruptcy. That was my opening. I created a company with a name that sounded foreign and important. Through my lawyer, Peter, this fake company made an offer on Frank and Diane's house. It was a fantastic offer, way more than the house was worth. They would not only pay off their debts, but also have a lot of money left over. As I expected, they jumped at the chance. They were so blinded by greed they didn't ask too many questions. I watched from a distance as they celebrated. I saw them buying a new luxury car before the sale was even final. They were bragging to the whole family about the rich foreign investor who had saved them. The day the sale closed was the first step of my plan. The money was transferred to their account. They moved out of the house and into a temporary rental, planning a big trip to celebrate their new wealth. A week later, I sent out invitations to my entire family. It was for a housewarming party at my new home. The address on the invitation was, of course, the very same house Frank and Diane had just sold. I knew their curiosity would be too strong to resist. They would all come to see the rich man who had bought my brother's house, and they would want to see how I, the family failure, would react to it. The night of the party, I stood in the living room that I used to visit on holidays, the same room where Frank had called me a failure. The whole family was there, whispering and looking around. Then Frank and Diane walked in, smiling, ready to meet the new owner. Their smiles froze when they saw me. They looked at me, then around the room and back at me. Confusion turned to shock, then to horror. I walked over to them, holding a glass of sparkling water. "Frank, Diane," I said, my voice calm and clear. "Welcome. I'm so glad you could make it. I wanted to thank you in person for selling me your beautiful home." A gasp went through the room. Frank's face turned pale. What are you talking about? This isn't possible," he stammered. I smiled. "Oh, it's very possible. You see, Uncle Arnold did quite well for himself, and he left it all to me, the failure." I looked around at the stunned faces of my aunts, uncles, and cousins. "You all listened when they told you I was nothing. You all turned away. This house, this symbol of their fake success, was built on lies and cruelty, and now it's mine. I wanted you all to be here to see it." Diane started to cry, a pathetic whimpering sound. Frank just stood there, his mouth open, completely broken. The revenge was complete. It didn't feel like joy, it felt like justice. It was the end of my old life and finally the beginning of a new one. The silence in the room was heavy, thick enough to be cut with a knife. Diane's sobs were the only sound, each one a sharp, painful note in the quiet. Frank's face had gone from pale to a blotchy red. His fists were clenched at his sides, and for a moment I thought he might lunge at me, but he didn't. All the fight had drained out of him, leaving behind the empty shell of a bully who had just lost his power. He looked around at our family, his eyes pleading for someone to say something, to deny what was happening, but they all just stared, their expressions a mix of shock and a little bit of fear. They were looking at me differently now. I wasn't the failure anymore. I was the one holding all the cards. "Get out," Frank finally whispered, his voice cracking. I raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, I think you're confused," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "This is my house now. It's you who needs to leave." I took a small step toward him, and he actually flinched. The man who had mocked me, who had enjoyed my suffering, was afraid of me. "Your things are in storage. My lawyer, Peter, has the details. You can pick them up tomorrow." Diane let out a loud wail and grabbed Frank's arm. "Do something," she cried, but he was frozen, completely defeated. They turned and walked toward the door, a parade of two shamed people. The rest of the family parted for them like a sea, nobody wanting to be associated with their fall. As the door closed behind them, a new silence fell, but this one was different. It was filled with questions and recalculations as every relative in that room tried to figure out their new place in my world. A few days later, the high of my victory began to fade, replaced by a strange emptiness. The revenge was done. I had won, but I was still alone in a big, quiet house. It was clean. It was mine, but it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a monument to my pain. I spent my days walking through the rooms, the ghost of my anger my only company. One afternoon, while sorting through some mail Peter had forwarded, I saw a letter with familiar handwriting. It was from Lisa, my ex-wife. My heart gave a painful thud. I almost threw it away, but curiosity, that old enemy, got the better of me. Her letter was full of regret, saying she'd heard about my good fortune and that she had made a terrible mistake. She said she missed me and wanted to see me, to talk things over. It was so predictable it was almost funny. She didn't miss me. She missed the idea of my $47 million. The letter didn't make me angry. It just made me tired. I decided I needed to get out of the house. I started taking long walks in a different park, far from the one where I used to sleep on a bench. One sunny morning I sat down to read a book, trying to feel normal. A woman sat on the other end of the bench, sketching in a notebook. After a few minutes, her pencil rolled off the bench and stopped near my foot. I picked it up and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said, giving me a warm smile. She had kind eyes. "I'm Caroline," she added. "I'm Michael," I replied. We started talking. It was easy, natural. She was an art teacher at a local school. She didn't ask what I did for a living, and I didn't offer. For the first time in years, I was just a man on a park bench talking to a woman with no history and no expectations. It felt good. We met at the park a few more times. Talking with Caroline was like a breath of fresh air. She saw me, not my bank account. One day, I finally decided to deal with Lisa. I agreed to meet her at a simple coffee shop, a neutral place. She walked in wearing an expensive dress, looking like she was ready for a fancy dinner. She started talking about our shared memories, her voice soft and sweet. But I wasn't the same man she had destroyed. I listened patiently until she finished. "Lisa," I said calmly, "you didn't love me when I had nothing, and you don't love me now. You love what you think I have. The man you left is gone. He died on a park bench a few months ago." I stood up, leaving enough money on the table to cover her coffee. "Goodbye, Lisa." I walked out without looking back, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I didn't even know was still there. That chapter was finally, truly closed. That evening, I thought about Uncle Arnold's letter. Build a life they can only dream of. I was beginning to understand what he meant. It wasn't about the big house or the fancy cars that Frank and Diane wanted. It was about peace. It was about freedom. The next day, I called Peter. "I want to start a foundation," I told him, "in my uncle's name. I want to help people who have been cast out, people who have lost everything and have nowhere to turn." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Peter's voice full of warmth. "I think your uncle would have liked that very much, Michael." As I hung up the phone, I looked out the window of my big, beautiful house. For the first time, it didn't feel like a weapon or a trophy. It felt like a starting point. The revenge was over, but my new life, a life of purpose, was just beginning. The work on the foundation began immediately. Peter, my lawyer, was more than just a legal guide. He became a trusted advisor. We named it the Arnold Foundation, a simple tribute to the man who gave me a second chance. Our mission was clear: to provide temporary housing and job support for people who had been kicked out of their homes, especially those abandoned by their families. The big house, once a cold trophy of my victory, started to feel different. We converted some of the guest rooms into temporary offices. The echoes of past arguments were slowly being replaced by the sounds of planning and hope. It was a strange feeling, turning a place of pain into a source of help for others. My time with Caroline also became more frequent. We moved from park benches to small cafes and long walks by the water. She knew I had come into money, but I had been vague about the details, and she never pushed. "Money doesn't tell me who you are, Michael," she said one afternoon. "Your actions do." Her presence was like a calm harbor in a stormy sea. With her, I wasn't the failure or the millionaire. I was just Michael. We talked about her art, the kids she taught, and her dream of opening a small community art center. For the first time, I felt a connection that wasn't tied to my past or my bank account. It was simple and it was real. A month later, the past came knocking. A formal letter arrived, sent from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was from a lawyer named Vincent, representing Frank and Diane. My brother and his wife were suing me. The letter was full of nonsense, claiming Uncle Arnold had been mentally unwell when he wrote his will, and that I had somehow manipulated him. They demanded half of the inheritance. I felt a familiar surge of hot anger. After everything they had done, their greed was limitless. I immediately called Peter. "It's a desperate move, Michael," he said calmly. "They have no case, and they know it. They're hoping you'll pay them just to make them go away." That evening, I told Caroline about the lawsuit. I expected her to be shocked, but she just listened patiently, her kind eyes watching me. "What do you want to do?" she asked when I finished. The question caught me off guard. "I want to fight them. I want to crush them in court and leave them with nothing, not even their pride," I said, my voice rising. She nodded slowly. "You can do that," she said softly. "You have the money and the power. You'll win. But what happens after you win? Will you feel better? Or will you just be back where you started, filled with all that anger?" Her words hit me harder than any legal threat. She was right. Another fight would just drag me back into the darkness. I spent the next few days thinking. The foundation was starting to get its first applicants, people with stories sadly similar to my own. I read their letters, their words filled with desperation, but also a flicker of hope. These were the people Uncle Arnold wanted me to help. Wasting my energy and resources on a bitter court battle with Frank felt like a betrayal of his trust. It was exactly the kind of hateful drama my family loved, the very thing I wanted to escape. My revenge was supposed to be the end of that life, not the start of a new war. I knew what I had to do. I had Peter arrange a meeting, not with the lawyers, but with Frank and Diane directly. We met in a neutral conference room at Peter's office. They looked terrible. The fancy clothes they wore seemed out of place on their tired, stressed faces. Diane's eyes were puffy, and Frank had lost the arrogant posture I knew so well. He just looked like a defeated man. "I'm not giving you half of my inheritance," I began, my voice steady. "The lawsuit is ridiculous, and we both know it." Frank started to protest, but I held up a hand. "But I'm not going to be like you. I won't watch you end up on the street." I pushed an envelope across the table. Inside is a check. It's not millions. It's enough for a deposit on a small apartment and to live on for 6 months. It's enough for a fresh start, somewhere else. There's also a condition. You sign a document right now, dropping this lawsuit and agreeing to never contact me again. Diane grabbed the envelope and tore it open, her eyes widening at the amount. It was a generous offer, far more than they deserved. Frank just stared at me, his expression a mixture of shame and disbelief. "Why?" he croaked. "After everything, why would you help us at all?" I looked my brother in the eye, and for the first time I didn't feel anger, only a sad kind of pity. "Because my uncle taught me that you don't let them win," I said. "And for me, winning isn't about destroying you. It's about being free of you. Now sign the papers." They signed. As they left the room, I didn't feel triumph, just relief. The final chain to my old life had just been broken. I was truly free. With the papers signed and my brother gone, a profound quiet settled over my life. It wasn't the empty silence of a lonely mansion anymore. It was the calm after a long, violent storm. The final link to the bitterness of my past had been severed, not with a crash of thunder, but with the simple scratch of a pen. The house itself seemed to breathe easier. Working with Peter, we turned the ground floor into the headquarters for the Arnold Foundation. The formal dining room where my family had judged me now held desks and filing cabinets. The sounds of ringing phones and quiet discussions about helping others began to fill the space, chasing away the ghosts of old arguments. It was a cleansing. A few weeks later, our first case file landed on my desk. It was the story of an older man named Thomas. He was a retired mechanic whose children had sold his small house from under him after his wife died, claiming he was too old to live alone and putting him in a cheap retirement home he couldn't stand. He had left with nothing but a small bag of clothes and was now staying in a temporary shelter. His story was a painful echo of my own, being discarded by the people who were supposed to love you most. I knew immediately that this was why my uncle had left me his fortune. This was the work I was meant to do. I arranged to meet Thomas at a simple cafe. He was a man with tired eyes and hands still stained with the faint memory of oil and grease. He spoke softly, not with self-pity, but with a deep, weary sadness. "They just wanted the money from the house," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "My own kids, they looked at me like I was just a piece of old furniture they didn't want anymore." I didn't tell him my whole story, but I told him enough. "I know what it feels like to be cast out, Thomas," I said, "but your life isn't over. We're going to help you find a new place, a small apartment of your own, and we'll help you get back on your feet." A flicker of light returned to his eyes, the first spark of hope he'd felt in months. That evening, I knew I had to be completely honest with Caroline. I invited her over for dinner, not to the fancy dining room, but to the small, cozy kitchen. I cooked a simple meal, just like two normal people would. When she arrived, she looked around, not at the high ceilings or expensive furniture, but at the whiteboards on the wall covered in plans for the foundation. "This is amazing, Michael," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "You're turning this place into something that matters." Her reaction was all the confirmation I ever needed. She didn't see a rich man. She saw a man trying to do some good in the world. As we ate, I told her everything. I told her about the cruelty of Frank and Diane, the cold rejection from my parents, and the heartbreak with Lisa. I described the crushing despair of being homeless, the feeling of being invisible. I didn't hold anything back. She listened without interruption, her hand resting gently on mine across the table. When I finished, she didn't offer pity. She offered understanding. "You survived, Michael," she said softly. You went through all that, and instead of letting the anger consume you, you're using it to help people. That's who you are. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever buy. Now tell me about your dream, I said, changing the subject. The Community Art Center. Her face lit up. She described a place where kids from poor neighborhoods could come after school to paint and draw, a safe space to be creative. She talked about offering classes for adults, helping people find their voice through art. She had it all planned out, but the lack of funding had always made it seem like an impossible fantasy. It's a beautiful dream, Caroline, I said, and I don't think it has to be a fantasy. I took her hand. The Arnold Foundation isn't just about housing. It's about helping people rebuild their lives. Your art center would do that. It would give people hope and a sense of purpose. Her eyes widened as she understood what I was saying. I want to be your partner on this, I continued. Not as a donor who writes a check, but as a partner. We can build it together. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. She squeezed my hand, unable to speak for a moment, and then she just nodded, a huge, beautiful smile spreading across her face. Standing with her in the kitchen of my huge house, I finally understood the last line of my uncle's letter. Build a life they can only dream of. Frank and Diane dreamed of a life of empty luxury, of showing off wealth they didn't have. But the life I was building now was something they could never comprehend. It was a life filled with purpose, connection, and a quiet, steady happiness. It was a life built not from the ashes of revenge, but on the solid ground of compassion. The revenge was over. My real life, the one Uncle Arnold wanted for me, had finally, truly begun. The months that followed were a blur of creation. Caroline and I threw ourselves into planning the art center. We found the perfect building, an old warehouse in a neighborhood that needed it most. We spent our days with architects and contractors and our evenings poring over blueprints at my kitchen table. For the first time in years, I felt a genuine partnership. With Lisa, I had always felt like I was trying to earn my place. With Caroline, I felt like an equal. We were building something together, brick by brick, dream by dream. The Arnold Foundation was also growing. We helped a dozen more families like Thomas's, providing them with security deposits, legal help, and a chance to start over. Each success story was a small victory against the kind of cruelty I had experienced. One afternoon, while Caroline and I were covered in paint, testing colors for the main hall of the art center, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello? I said. There was a pause and then a hesitant voice I hadn't heard in over a year. Michael, it's your mother. My heart stopped. I put the paintbrush down, my hand suddenly unsteady. It was Frances, my mom. I hadn't spoken to her or my father since before the divorce, since they chose to believe Frank and Diane's lies. What do you want? I asked, my voice colder than I intended. Your father and we saw an article about your foundation, she said, her voice wavering. We are so proud of what you're doing. It's wonderful. The words felt hollow like fake coins. Proud? Where was this pride when I was sleeping on a park bench? We were wondering if we could see you, she continued, to talk, to clear the air. I looked at Caroline, who was watching me with concern. The old anger started to bubble up inside me, hot and familiar, but then I looked around at the bright, hopeful colors on the walls, at the life I was building. That anger had no place here anymore. Fine, I said. My office. Tomorrow at 10. The next day, my parents, Eugene and Frances, sat across from me in the same conference room where I had last seen Frank and Diane. They looked older, more fragile than I remembered. My father, Eugene, a man who had always seemed so large and commanding, now just looked tired. They spoke for nearly an hour. They told me they were sorry, but their apologies were full of excuses. Frank can be very convincing, my mother said. We didn't know the whole story, my father added. They never once said the simple words I needed to hear. We were wrong. We abandoned you. They talked about their financial troubles, how their investments had gone bad. The real reason for their visit slowly became clear. They didn't want their son back. They wanted a loan. I let them finish, listening quietly. The old Michael would have screamed, would have listed every single one of their betrayals, but I wasn't that person anymore. When they were done, a heavy silence filled the room. I looked at them, not as my parents, but as two people who had made a choice. I'm not angry anymore, I said, and was surprised to find it was true, but I'm also not forgetting. You weren't there when I needed you. You closed the door on me when I had nothing. I stood up. The foundation helps people who have been cast out by their families. You know, people like me. But it doesn't reward the ones who did the casting out. I wish you both well, but this is goodbye. I walked out of the room without looking back, leaving them with their shock and their excuses. I didn't feel triumph, just a quiet finality. Another chain had been broken. A few weeks later was the grand opening of the Arnold Center for the Arts. The place was buzzing with life. Kids were running around with paint on their faces, and local artists displayed their work on the freshly painted walls. Caroline stood by my side, her face glowing with happiness. She had created a masterpiece of hope. I saw Thomas there, talking to a young man, showing him how to hold a paintbrush. He looked like a different person, his eyes full of life. This was my family now, this community of survivors and dreamers. Later that evening, a shy teenager approached me. His name was Joshua. "Are you the guy who built this place?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, with my partner Caroline." He held up a sketchbook. Inside was an incredible drawing of the city skyline, full of detail and emotion. "I never had a place to do this before," he said quietly. "Thank you." In that moment, I finally understood everything. My uncle's revenge wasn't about destroying my old family. It was about building a new one. It was about creating a life so full of purpose and joy that the ghosts of the past simply had no room to exist. They could have their bitterness and their greed. I had this, and it was more than they could ever dream of. Life settled into a rhythm I never thought possible. The following 6 months were the happiest I had been in over a decade. The Arnold Center for the Arts became a beacon in the community, a vibrant hub of creativity and noise. Caroline was the heart of it all, and watching her teach a class of kids, her face smudged with paint, filled me with a quiet joy. Our partnership had blossomed into a deep, loving relationship built on mutual respect. We weren't just building a foundation, we were building a life. The ghosts of my past were finally fading, replaced by the laughter of children and the smell of wet clay. I thought that chapter was closed for good. Then, one sunny afternoon, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my office. It felt cold and heavy in my hands. Inside, a stack of legal documents stared back at me, the formal language a stark contrast to the colorful paintings on my office walls. It was a lawsuit. Frank, Diane, and my ex-wife Lisa were suing me. They were contesting Uncle Arnold's will. They claimed he was not of sound mind when he named me his sole heir. They accused me of misusing the funds for vanity projects, instead of preserving what they called the family legacy. The words were a punch to the gut. They weren't just coming for the money. They were trying to poison everything I had built. The old helpless anger flickered inside me, but it was quickly replaced by a cold resolve. I wasn't that man on the park bench anymore. I called Caroline, my voice steady. "They're coming after us," I said simply. "I need to find a lawyer." The next day, I was sitting in the office of Arthur, a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through any nonsense. He read the documents in silence, his expression unreadable. "This is a classic harassment suit," he finally said, placing the papers neatly on his desk. "Their case is weak. We have doctor's records proving your uncle's competence, but they don't need to win in court, Michael." He leaned forward. "Their goal is to drag this out. They want to bury you in legal fees and smear your name in the press. They'll leak stories, make accusations. They want to destroy the foundation's reputation and, by extension, yours. They want to make your new life so miserable that you'll pay them to go away." The strategy was cruel and petty, and it had Frank's fingerprints all over it. He couldn't stand seeing me happy. If he couldn't have my money, he would burn my world to the ground. "So what do we do?" I asked. Arthur smiled faintly. "We don't play their game. We play ours. We don't just defend, we attack." That evening, I knew Arthur was right. A defensive battle would let them control the story. I had to get ahead of it. I had to understand what was really driving them, beyond simple greed and jealousy. Arthur recommended a man named Victor, a private investigator who was discreet and incredibly thorough. I met him in a quiet coffee shop far from my neighborhood. Victor was a quiet, observant man who listened more than he spoke. "I don't want anything illegal," I told him. "I just want the truth. I need to know what's going on with my brother and his wife, their finances, their associates, everything. I need to know why they are this desperate." Victor simply nodded. "Desperate people leave trails," he said. "I'll find them." A week passed, the longest of my life. The lawsuit hung over me like a dark cloud, threatening the sunshine Caroline and I had found. I tried to focus on the foundation, but the thought of Frank's smug face was always there. Then Victor called. He had found something. We met again, and he laid out a folder on the table. It was filled with bank statements, credit card bills, and property records. "Your brother is drowning in debt," Victor explained. "He and his wife have been living a life they can't afford for years. Second mortgage on the house, maxed out credit cards, huge loans from private lenders. They've been putting on a show for their friends, but the whole thing is a house of cards. My own family turned on me after the divorce. What would you do if your brother Frank sided with your ex-wife? Comment your thoughts and share this story." He pointed to a specific document. It was a loan agreement with a ridiculously high interest rate due in 3 months. The amount was staggering. If they didn't pay, they would lose everything. "This isn't just about jealousy, Michael," Victor said. "This is about survival. They're not just trying to get rich, they're trying to not end up on the street." The irony was bitter. The very fate they had so casually wished upon me was now knocking on their own door. They had called me a failure while their own lives were built on a foundation of lies and debt. This wasn't a power play. It was a desperate, pathetic gamble, and I finally knew exactly how to end it. My revenge wouldn't be loud or destructive. It would be quiet, precise, and absolute. I walked into Arthur's office the next morning with Victor's folder in my hand. The information inside felt like a heavy stone, but it was a stone I could now use to build a wall or to crush my enemies. I chose the latter. I laid the documents on his polished desk. Arthur read through them, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He didn't show any surprise, just a quiet, professional interest. When he finished, he folded his hands and looked at me. "So, they're cornered animals," he said. "That makes them more dangerous, but also more predictable. They'll do anything to get out of this hole." "I don't want to defend against their lawsuit, Arthur," I said, my voice steady. "I want to end it. I want to make it so they never think about coming after me or this foundation ever again." Arthur nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "I had a feeling you'd say that. A defensive fight is long, expensive, and public. They want to drag your name through the mud. We need to cut the head off the snake." He leaned back in his chair. "You have the resources to play a different game. You told me you wanted to attack. This information gives us the weapon. Your brother's biggest debt is with a private lender, a loan shark in a suit. These types are always willing to sell their debt for a quick profit, especially if they think it might go bad. The plan was simple and brutal. I wouldn't fight them in the court of public opinion. I would buy the ground out from under them." Arthur made a call to a man named Daniel, a financial specialist who operated in the quiet, gray areas of high finance. Daniel was the kind of man who could move millions with a few phone calls and leave no fingerprints. We met that afternoon. He was calm, efficient, and asked no questions about my motives. He just looked at the numbers. "This can be done," Daniel said, his tone flat. "It will be discreet. As far as your brother knows, his debt has just been sold to another investment firm. He'll never know it's you." Within 48 hours, it was done. For a fraction of my inheritance, I became the man Frank owed everything to. I owned his house, his car, his future. I held the string to his entire house of cards. A week later, with the loan's due date just around the corner, I had Arthur send a letter to Frank, Diane, and Lisa's lawyer. It was an invitation to my office to discuss a potential settlement. I knew their desperation would make them jump at the chance. They would walk in thinking they held the power, believing their nuisance lawsuit was about to pay off. The day of the meeting, I felt a strange calm. Caroline squeezed my hand before I left the art center. "Remember who you are now, Michael," she said. "You're not that man on the bench." She was right. That man was gone, and he wasn't coming back. They arrived exactly on time, a united front of greed and arrogance. Frank did all the talking, his voice filled with the same smug satisfaction I remembered so well. Diane and Lisa sat beside him, nodding along like puppets. "We're prepared to settle this quietly, Michael," Frank began, trying to sound reasonable. "For the sake of the family legacy, a payment of $5 million will make this all go away. We'll drop the suit, and you can continue with your little art project." I let him talk, let him lay out all his petty demands. I watched his face, seeing the deep lines of stress around his eyes that his fake confidence couldn't hide. He was performing, putting on a show. When he finally finished, I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at him. Then, I slid a single folder across the table. It wasn't the lawsuit file. It was the loan agreement. His loan agreement, now owned by a holding company that I controlled. Frank opened it, confused. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. I watched the color drain from his face. He looked up at me, his mouth slightly open, his arrogance vanishing like smoke. What is this?" he stammered. "That's your debt, Frank," I said quietly. "The one that's due in 3 days. The one that will make you lose your house, your cars, everything you've pretended to own for the last 10 years. I bought it." Diane and Lisa leaned over to look, their expressions shifting from confusion to pure horror. "You see, you're not suing a failure anymore," I continued, my voice even and cold. "You're begging from your creditor." The room was silent, except for Frank's ragged breathing. All the power, all the control, had shifted in an instant. "So, here's my settlement offer," I said, leaning forward. "You will drop this lawsuit today. You will sign a document admitting it was baseless and filed in bad faith. You will never contact me or my foundation again. In return, I will restructure your debt. I'll give you a fair interest rate and 20 years to pay it off. You won't lose your house." I stood up. "Or you can refuse. And in 3 days, I will take everything. The choice is yours." They just stared, utterly broken. My revenge was complete. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the quiet, final click of a lock turning. Frank's face was a mess of disbelief and terror. The arrogant mask he wore had shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind the weak, scared man I always knew was underneath. Diane stared at the papers as if they were a snake, her painted smile now a twisted line of fear. Lisa, my ex-wife, was completely pale. She seemed to shrink in her chair, suddenly looking small and insignificant. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. They were trapped, and they knew it. Frank was the first to break the silence. His voice was a pathetic whisper. "Michael, please, we're family. You can't do this to your own brother." The word family coming from his mouth felt like poison. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. "Family? Is that what you called me when you told Lisa I was a failure? Is that what you were thinking when you and Diane told our parents to turn their backs on me? When I was sleeping on a park bench? Where was my family then, Frank?" Each question was a cold, hard stone, and I watched them land, crushing his pathetic appeal. Their lawyer, a nervous man named Howard, cleared his throat. He tried to sound professional, but his voice shook a little. "Mr. Michael, this is highly irregular. regular. This could be seen as coercion. Using a private debt to influence a legal proceeding is. My lawyer, Arthur, cut him off without even raising his voice. Coercion? My client is a private investor who legally purchased a debt. He is now offering your clients an incredibly generous restructuring plan, far better than they would get from any bank. The lawsuit, on the other hand, is baseless. We have the evidence to prove it. There is no connection. One is a business matter, the other is a legal one. Your clients are free to choose. Arthur's calm, logical explanation was the final nail in their coffin. Howard slumped back in his chair, defeated. He had no argument because Arthur was right. Everything I did was legal. It was just ruthless. Diane finally snapped. She turned to Frank, her voice a low, vicious hiss. You fool. I told you this was a mistake. You and your stupid pride. You just had to poke the bear, didn't you? Now look at us. We're going to lose everything because of you. She started to cry, not tears of sadness, but of pure, selfish anger. Lisa just sat there, silent, her eyes wide with the horror of her own situation, tied to these two sinking ships. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the busy city below. I didn't need to watch them fall apart. Arthur has the papers ready, I said, my back to them. You have 1 hour to sign them. The lawsuit withdrawal, the public apology stating it was filed in bad faith, and the new loan agreement. If you don't, the offer is gone. In 3 days, the original debt comes due. The choice, as I said, is yours. I heard the rustle of papers as Arthur slid them across the table. I didn't turn around. I just listened to the sounds of their world ending. The scrape of a chair, a choked sob from Diane, and the heavy scratching of a pen. They signed everything. They left my office without another word. A broken trio of greedy, foolish people. They didn't look at me as they walked out. They couldn't. I had taken away their power, their arrogance, and their last pathetic hope. After they were gone, Arthur gathered the signed documents. It's done, he said quietly. They won't be bothering you again. I nodded, still looking out the window. The victory felt strange. It wasn't loud or exciting. It was quiet, empty. The anger that had fueled me for months had burned out, leaving behind a cold peace. I had won, but it felt more like I had just cleaned up a terrible mess. That evening, I went back to the foundation. The place was alive with color and creativity, a world away from the cold, legal battle I had just finished. Caroline was there, helping a group of young artists set up a new exhibit. She saw me and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She just came over and took my hand. It's over, isn't it? She asked softly. I squeezed her hand. Yes, I said. It's over. We walked through the gallery together, looking at the paintings. I saw a piece by a young artist I had sponsored, a vibrant canvas filled with hope. In that moment, I understood. My real revenge wasn't in the cold documents signed in my office. It was here. It was in building something beautiful from the ruins of my old life. They had tried to tear me down, but I had used the stones they threw to build a foundation, and it was stronger than they could ever imagine. The man on the park bench was truly gone forever. A couple of months passed. The silence from my family was absolute, just as I had demanded. The foundation, however, was loud with life. It was my sanctuary and my purpose. We launched a program to provide art supplies and studio space to low-income artists, people with talent who just needed a chance, like I once did. Seeing their faces light up, seeing the incredible work they produced, was a feeling no amount of revenge could ever match. I was building things, not tearing them down. Caroline was by my side through it all. She never saw me as the millionaire or the homeless man. She just saw Michael. Her belief in me was a quiet strength that helped heal the parts of me I thought were broken forever. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello, I said. A hesitant, frail voice answered. Michael, is that you? It's your mother. My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard her voice in over a year. It was the voice of a woman who had listened to my brother's lies and shut the door on her own son. What do you want? I asked, my tone flat and hard. I could hear her take a shaky breath. Your father and we saw the news about the lawsuit. Frank's apology. It didn't make any sense. He said you forced him. He said you were destroying the family. I almost laughed. He is the one who destroyed it, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. He stood by and watched as I lost everything. He poisoned you against me. So, if you're calling for money or to defend him, you're wasting your time. There was a long pause, and then I heard a sound I hadn't heard in years. My mother, Eleanor, crying. No, son, she sobbed. We were wrong. Your father, Harold, he's not well. The stress of all this. We just want to see you. Please, Michael, we need to understand. The plea in her voice hit a nerve I thought was long dead. It was the voice of my mom, the woman who used to read me stories at night. Against my better judgment, I felt a crack in the wall I had built around my heart. I told Caroline about the call that evening. She listened patiently, her expression full of empathy. What are you going to do? She asked softly. I shook my head. I don't know. A part of me wants to tell them to get lost, to let them feel a fraction of the abandonment I felt. But another part, I trailed off. Another part knows you're not that person anymore. She finished for me, taking my hand. You don't have to do anything for them, Michael, but maybe you need to do this for you. To close the book for good, one way or another. She was right. I couldn't move forward forward if I was still chained to the past. I agreed to meet them. We met at a small, quiet park, a neutral ground filled with memories of a happier time. Seeing them was a shock. My father, Harold, looked 10 years older. He was thin, and his hands trembled slightly. My mother's eyes were puffy and red. They didn't look like the confident, judgmental people who had cast me out. They looked like two old, scared people who had realized they made a terrible mistake. My father was the first to speak, his voice raspy. We believed him, Michael. Frank was always the golden boy, the successful one. When he told us you'd had some kind of breakdown, that you were unstable, it was easier to believe than to think we had raised a son who could be so cruel. Easier? I repeated, the word tasting like ash. It was easier to believe I was crazy than to pick up the phone and ask your other son if he was okay. When I was sleeping on a bench just a few miles from your warm house, was that easier too? The raw pain in my voice made my mother flinch. Tears streamed down her face. We're so sorry, Michael. There's not a day that goes by that we don't regret it. We let pride and fear blind us. He's not the man we thought he was. We see that now. My father nodded, looking down at his hands. He came to us for money after the settlement. He was like a cornered animal. All his stories fell apart. We saw the truth then. I listened to their confessions and apologies. The anger I expected to feel just wasn't there anymore. All I felt was a deep, lingering sadness for the years we had lost, for the family that had been broken by greed and lies. I wasn't the broken man on the bench anymore, and they weren't the unfeeling monsters from my memory. We were all just flawed people, caught in the wreckage of my brother's making. I took a deep breath. I can't forget what happened, I said, my voice steady. The pain was real, but I don't want to live in it anymore. I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw not just my accusers, but my parents. We can't go back, but maybe we can start again. Slowly, a flicker of hope appeared in their eyes, the first I had seen. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, and for the first time, it felt like my own. The next few weeks were strange. I spoke to my parents, Eleanor and Harold, on the phone a couple of times. The calls were awkward, filled with long silences. They would ask about the foundation, and I would give short, polite answers. They were trying. I could hear it in their hesitant voices. But the ghost of that park bench, of their closed door, always sat between us. A part of me still waited for the other shoe to drop, for them to defend Frank or ask for something, but they never did. They just sounded old and sad, and that was almost harder to deal with than the anger had been. One evening, Caroline and I were walking home from the foundation. The city lights were just starting to glitter. You seem distant tonight, she said, her voice gentle. I sighed, kicking a loose stone on the sidewalk. I'm thinking about my parents, I admitted. I don't know what to do with them. We talk, but we don't really say anything. It feels like we're walking on eggshells. She stopped and turned to face me. Maybe someone needs to be the first to step off the eggshells, she suggested. What does that even look like? I asked, genuinely lost. She smiled. It looks like dinner, a real one. Not in a park, but at a table, with plates and conversation. The thought terrified me, but she was right. Hiding behind polite phone calls wasn't a new beginning. It was just a longer ending. So, I invited them. My mother's gasp of surprise and gratitude over the phone was so genuine it made my chest ache. I decided to have the dinner at my new apartment, a place they had never seen, a place that was entirely mine. It felt important to meet on my ground, in the life I had built without them. The night they arrived, my hands were sweating. My father handed me a bottle of wine, avoiding my eyes. My mother gave me a nervous hug that felt both foreign and painfully familiar. The dinner was as awkward as I'd feared. We talked about the weather, about a popular novella, about anything except what really mattered. They praised my apartment, my success, the foundation. It felt like they were talking about a stranger, not their son. After a while, the forced small talk died, leaving a heavy silence. I was about to give up when I received a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Michael, my name is Stephen. I worked for your Uncle Arnold for 30 years. I have something of his I think you should see. It's not about money, it's about family. Reading the message felt like a jolt. Another ghost from the past, but this one felt different. I excused myself for a moment and read the message again. Uncle Arnold, the man who had given me this second chance. I returned to the table with a new resolve. I looked at my parents, who were staring at their plates. I got a message, I said, my voice steady, from a man named Stephen. He worked with Uncle Arnold. My father looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. Arnold? We haven't heard that name in... He trailed off. In a long time, my mother finished quietly. He was always so angry with us, with the whole family. That was the opening I needed, the first crack in the wall of silence. Why? I asked simply. Why was he so angry? My father, Harold, took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly as he put his fork down. Because we failed him, he said, his voice raspy with regret. Your grandfather? My father, he was a hard man. He wanted Arnold to take over the family business, a small hardware store. Arnold wanted to build things, to create. He had vision. My father called him a dreamer, a failure, and we all just stood by and let it happen. We chose my father's approval over our own brother. My mother started to cry softly. When Arnold finally left, he swore he'd never come back. He said he'd build a life they could only dream of. He used those exact words, Michael, the same words from his letter to you. The air in the room shifted. It was no longer about my pain, my abandonment. It was about a pattern, a family wound passing passed down through a generation. They hadn't just failed me, they had failed my uncle first. They had let fear and judgment break their family apart once before, and they had repeated the exact same mistake with me. Seeing their shame, their decades-old regret laid bare on the dinner table, my own anger finally dissolved completely. It was replaced by a profound sadness. They weren't monsters. They were just flawed, weak people who had made the same mistake twice. I reached across the table and put my hand over my mother's. She looked up, startled. "He left everything to me so I wouldn't make the same mistakes," I said softly, "so I would break the pattern." My father nodded, tears welling in his own eyes. "He was a better man than we were, son, and it seems you are too." That night, for the first time, we didn't just talk, we connected. We were three broken people finally looking at the pieces, wondering if we could maybe, just maybe, put some of them back together again. After my parents left that night, the apartment felt strangely quiet. The air was no longer thick with unspoken words and old regrets. It felt lighter, as if a window had been opened after being sealed for years. Caroline helped me clear the table, her presence a silent comfort. "That was a lot," she said, stacking the plates. I nodded, my mind still replaying my father's confession. "It was," I agreed. "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm the only ghost at their table. It turns out Uncle Arnold has been sitting there with me all along." I looked at my phone, at the message from Stephen. It felt like a key had just been handed to me, a key to a room I never knew existed. The next morning, I called the number. A calm, older voice answered. "Stephen speaking." I introduced myself, and he immediately knew who I was. "Mr. Michael, I'm so glad you called. I was a friend of your uncle's, not just an employee. He talked about you sometimes, especially in the later years." His voice was kind, filled with a warmth that felt genuine. I asked him about the thing he wanted to show me. "It's better if I give it to you in person," he said. "It's a box. He told me to give it to you if the family ever did to you what they did to him." We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop downtown that afternoon. I told Caroline about the meeting. She offered to come with me, but I felt this was something I had to do alone. It was a piece of my family's broken past, and I needed to face it on my own terms. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I easily spotted him. Stephen was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing a simple button-down shirt. He looked like someone's favorite grandfather. He stood up and shook my hand firmly. "It's good to finally meet you, son," he said. "Your uncle would be proud of the man you've become." We sat down, and after a few minutes of polite chat, he slid a heavy, dark wooden box across the table. It was old, with a simple brass lock. "Arnold kept this his whole life," Stephen explained, his voice soft. "He called it his box of reasons. Reasons why he left. Reasons why he couldn't go back. He put things in here over the years. Letters, notes, memories. He wanted you to have it. He said you'd understand." He handed me a small, ornate key. He made a new life for himself, a good one, but he never forgot. He didn't want you to be consumed by anger the way he almost was. I held the key in my hand. It felt heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. I thanked Stephen, my voice thick with emotion. He simply patted my hand. "He was a good man, Michael. Don't let anyone ever tell you different." I took the box back to my apartment. It sat on my coffee table for a few hours, a silent monument to a life I barely knew. Caroline came home and saw it immediately. She didn't ask what was inside. She just sat next to me on the sofa and took my hand, offering her strength. Finally, with a deep breath, I put the key in the lock and turned it. The click echoed in the quiet room. I lifted the lid. The inside was lined with faded velvet and smelled of old paper and cedar. It was filled with letters, tied in bundles with string, a few old photographs, and a single leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal first. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years ago. I opened it and began to read Arnold's elegant handwriting. "My father called me a failure today," the first line read. "He said my ideas were worthless dreams." Harold and the others just stood there. They said nothing. Their silence was worse than his shouting. It was the silence of agreement. I realized today I'm alone in my own home. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was my story, written in a different time, by a different man. I read on, page after page, about his struggle, his ambition, and the constant dismissal from his family. He wrote about leaving with nothing but a few hundred reais in his pocket, determined to prove them all wrong. He wrote about the loneliness, the hard years, and the small victories that kept him going. Then I found an entry that made me stop breathing. "Harold called," it said. "He asked for money. The hardware store is failing. Father is ill." I wanted to say yes, he is my brother. But then he said, "Father always said you were the selfish one." And I knew. They don't want me. They want what I have. I sent a small amount for my mother's sake, but I told him never to call again. I have closed that door. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed. Reading those words, I finally understood. This wasn't just my inheritance. It was a legacy, a warning, blessing, and a second chance to break a curse that had haunted my family for generations. I closed the journal, but the words echoed in the room. Caroline's hand was a warm anchor on mine, keeping me from drifting away into the sea of the past. It's the same story, I whispered, my voice hoarse. They did the exact same thing to him. She squeezed my hand gently. But the ending will be different, she said, her voice firm with a belief I was only just starting to find in myself. You're not alone, Michael. I spent the next 2 days absorbed in that box. It was like excavating a forgotten tomb, uncovering the life of a man who was more than just a ghost in my family's history. He was real, ambitious, and deeply wounded. I found bundles of letters tied with old string. Many were from a woman named Beatrice. Her letters were full of life, encouragement, and love. She wrote to him from another country where she had moved for work. Don't let their small minds shrink your dreams, Arnold, she wrote in one. You are bigger than that town, bigger than their bitterness. It was clear they were in love, but the distance and his family's rejection had made a life together impossible. He had chosen to build his empire alone rather than ask her to share his struggle. It was a story of sacrifice, not just anger. It made my uncle feel even more human, more tragic. Then I found something that made my stomach clench. It was a stack of about a dozen letters, all unopened, all addressed to Arnold in my mother's handwriting. They were postmarked over a period of 5 years, long after he had left. He had never even read them. He had shut the door so completely that he couldn't risk the pain of seeing what was on the other side. I understood that impulse. It was the same one that had made me want to cut my own parents off forever. Arnold had built walls around his heart to survive, and in doing so, he had missed a chance, however small, for connection. This box wasn't just a warning. It was a roadmap of a lonely path I was dangerously close to following. A few days later, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Caroline was at work, and I had been planning a quiet day. I opened the door to find my brother, Frank, standing there. He looked out of place in the modern hallway, his face a mixture of envy and false confidence. He looked past me, his eyes scanning the apartment. So, it's true, he said, a bitter little smile on his lips. The family failure hit the jackpot. I felt the old anger flare up, hot and familiar. But then I thought of Arnold's journal, of the returned letters. This was a test. What do you want, Frank? I asked, my voice calm and even. I didn't invite him in. He shifted his weight, the confidence wavering. Look, Michael, I know things have been difficult between us, he began, the fake apology sticking in his throat. But we're family, and family should share their good fortune. Diane and I were having some financial trouble. A piece of that inheritance would really help us out. It's only fair. Fair. The word was so absurd it was almost funny. He hadn't spoken to me in a year, except to call me a failure. Now he was talking about fairness. No, I said simply. Frank's face turned red. No? What do you mean, no? After everything. We're your blood, he sputtered. Blood didn't stop you from kicking me when I was down, I replied, my voice still quiet. It didn't stop you, or Mom and Dad, from doing the same thing to Uncle Arnold 40 years ago. I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He barely remembered Arnold. What does he have to do with this? Frank demanded. Everything, I said. He left me this money because he knew you. He knew all of you. He knew you'd see it as a pile of cash to be divided up, not as a chance to build something better. I stepped back from the door. This money isn't for paying off your debts, Frank. It's for breaking the cycle you're still stuck in. The cycle of jealousy and bitterness that drove Arnold away and almost destroyed me. I looked him straight in the eye. You want help? I'll pay for you and Diane to see a financial advisor. I'll help you find a new job. I will help you learn to stand on your own 2 feet, but I will not give you a single real to feed the same greed that has poisoned this family for generations. That's my final answer. He stared at me, speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The entitlement in his eyes slowly curdled into pure hatred. He spun around without another word and stormed off down the hall. As I closed the door, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, profound sadness, but also a strange sense of peace. I hadn't destroyed him. I had simply refused to let him destroy me. The pattern was broken. The curse was lifted. It was finally time to build. My journey from homelessness to inheriting millions fueled by a family's betrayal and a vengeful uncle's will is complete. What did you think of this unexpected twist? Subscribe for more intense stories like mine.